Welcome to chapters 17 to 19. After the Civil War, farmers were struggling economically. They were overproducing crops and also relying on loans, but due to deflation, they were forced to pay their loans while also making less money. The Farmers Alliance was created to combat these issues. They wanted a sub-treasury plan for the government to give loans at low interest rates. As the movement grew, they became known as the Populist Party and had several demands. In 1896, the Populists decided to run on silver instead of gold, but they didn't have as much support in the South as in the North due to lack of aid to black farmers. The Populists nominate William Jennings Bryan in the 1986 election, as well as the Democrats. However, William McKinley is elected. The Populist Party was only known for their focus on silver and died after 1896, but led to the began when the Union contract with Carnegie Steel was going to expire July 1, 1892. Carnegie was out of town and allowed his partner, Henry Frick, freedom to act against the Union. He began to cut wages of workers. However, the Union members rejected the wage cut. In response, the workers were locked out of the building and barbed wire was placed on fences. Carnegie started hiring non-union workers, or scabs, to replace the union workers. In response, workers and their families stormed the plant, resulting in shots fired and armed guards being brought in. Carnegie Steel was victorious in the end, but the strike proved that the workers and Americans were denied a democratic self-government and economic independence. The Pullman strike began when George Pullman refused to meet with workers to discuss the wage cuts at the Pullman Palace Car Company. Workers walked out on the job and had no choice but to strike. The American Railway Union helped to back Pullman workers and announced that their members would no longer handle trains with Pullman cars. Richard Olney, President Grover Cleveland's Attorney General, got a federal court injunction that ordered strikers back to work. After leader Eugene V. Debs was arrested for violating the court order, the strike collapsed. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first significant restriction on immigrants entering the United States. President Chester Arthur signed this act in 1882 for a 10-year ban on Chinese who were trying to come to the United States. In 1909, Chinese living in the United States were forced to carry around identification cards that looked like mugshots in case they were questioned. Republican William McKinley, the former governor of Ohio, was nominated in the 1896 election against William Jennings Bryan and won. McKinley led the United States to a victory in the Spanish-American War after having to make the decision to take America into battle. McKinley also kept the gold standard, not silver, and was known for the McKinley Tariff that boosted protective tariffs. He was re-elected in 1900, but was assassinated in 1901 while in New York. His vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, then became the new president. The Spanish-American War. Cuba was under control of Spain, leading to Cubans engaging in guerrilla warfare and the Spanish retaliating by putting them in reconcentration camps. Cuba was fighting for liberty and democracy, and American newspapers supported them. McKinley eventually decides to send the battleship Maine into the Havana harbor to protect American citizens, where it is blown up, killing almost 270 people. Later in April, he decides to ask for a declaration of war. The war lasted 4 months and was concluded by the Treaty of Peace, and the U.S. gaining the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. The Teller Amendment is established to support the U.S. helping Cuba for humanitarian purposes and not to annex Cuba, and the Platt Amendment was also established to declare the U.S. can intervene in Cuba whenever they want. After Spain relinquished control over the colonies, American intervention was welcomed in the Philippines. The Filipinos gained control of greater access to American markets, as well as America's ability to fend off radical changes and the democratic ideals they upheld. As American control over the Philippines increased, the Filipinos were upset. The U.S. Army burned down villages and created camps that forced the Filipinos to starve and led to many deaths. The McKinley administration claimed the battle was justified because they needed to uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos. The war lasted for about 3 years and led to many unjustified deaths.
The Progressive Era was a period of economic growth which was fueled by industrial production and expansion of the consumer markets and population growth. Scientific management was a variety of progressivism ideals and intended to streamline production and raise profit through managing the practices and costs in workplace. Politically, progressive people hoped to bring back a more activist, socially aware government. During the Progressive Era, there were 3 presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. In the West, there was the Oregon system, which focused on three main points: initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiative focused on making direct legislature to make real changes to laws. Referendum focused on making it so people were voting through a popular vote on public policy. And finally, recall focused on allowing the people to directly remove officials through a popular vote. During Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, he gained a reputation of being a trust buster because he wanted to eliminate bad trusts. Through his square deal policy, he attempted to distinguish between good and bad trusts so the bad ones could be broken. Through his conservation movement, he created the first national park, Yellowstone, which aimed to preserve land for animals to try and prevent environmental problems like deforestation. The Roosevelt Corollary said that the U.S. had the power to police countries in the Western Hemisphere, including but not limited to the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Haiti. During his presidency, the Panama Canal was built, which went between Panama and Colombia and was 10 miles long. New nationalism was Roosevelt's platform when running for the 1912 election and focused on heavy taxes and federal regulations. During William Howard Taft's presidency, he was specifically chosen by Roosevelt to become the next president, which helped him to win the election. During his presidency, he signed into action the 16th Amendment, which implemented an income tax, and he also signed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, which reduced the rate of taxes on imported goods. And his dollar diplomacy focused on using investments and loans from the banks instead of military intervention to spread American influence. During Woodrow Wilson's presidency, when running, he used the platform of New Freedom, which focused on the federal government strengthening antitrust laws, protecting the right of workers to form unions, and renewing economic competition in the U.S. without government regulating the economy. He also created the Federal Reserve Act, which was the new national bank, which is still in place today. It monitors businesses' risks and tries to ensure a healthy economy. This was also the nation's third bank. Through his 14 points, he explained his goals of peace for the end of the war, World War I. And inside of his 14 points, it included an idea for the League of Nations. Also during his presidency, he signed into action the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Some important people during the Progressive Era were Jane Addams,
segregation in the South, and Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were a collection of laws implemented in the South that legalized racial segregation. The laws were named after a black minstrel show character and existed for about 100 years before ending in 1968. Jim Crow laws existed in most public facilities such as hospitals, schools, and public transportation systems like buses and trains. Jim Crow laws restricted the rights of Black Americans to vote, receive educations, hold jobs, and more. Resistance to the laws often resulted in arrests, fines, violence, or death. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Both Washington and Du Bois were civil rights activists, but they did not act in the same way. Washington believed in gradual equality. He received white support but not always support from black liberals. Washington focused mainly on job skills and emphasized black economic freedom. Washington was born into slavery, while Du Bois, on the other hand, was not. Du Bois desired immediate equality. He was supported by black liberals and focused on education for black Americans. This is where his idea of the talented 10th came from, where the top 10% of black men were responsible for working to achieve civil and political rights of African Americans. Woodrow Wilson and his re-election campaign, he kept us out of war. In May of 1916, Germany announced the suspension of submarine warfare against non-combatants. Wilson won his re-election campaign in 1912 by 23 electoral votes, one of the closest presidential votes in history. Wilson required the votes of women in order to secure the win. In January of 1917, Wilson announced Peace Without Victory, in which he stated that attaining world peace was more important than winning the war. The Zimmermann Telegram. The Zimmermann Telegram was a message by German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, calling on Mexico to join the coming war against the United States and promising to help Mexico recover territory lost in the Mexican-American War. Wilson then went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. The war resolution passed in both the House and the Senate by a large margin. Wilson's 14 points focused on self-determination, freedom of the seas, and an end to secret treaties. Wilson's 14 points established the agenda for the peace conference following the war. A summary of World War I. The main reason for the United States entering the war, after declaring neutrality, was Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, especially the sinking of the Lusitania, which killed 128 Americans. The Central Powers in the war were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The Allied powers in the war were Great Britain, France, Russia, and Serbia.
One on the global stage. On the Western Front, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, which kicked off the war. It was Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Serbia against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Germany was fighting the war on two fronts. On one front, they were invading France through neutral Belgium in the west, and on the east side, they were confronting Russia. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the ruler of Austria-Hungary, gave a blank check assurance to Germany and financially backed the war. On the West Front, Germany was invading France, and they thought that it would be an easy win, but ultimately they were defeated. On the Eastern Front, Russia invaded Germany, and this took troops away from the fighting in France, which left Germany kind of frantic because they didn't have as many troops as they wanted to have fighting in France. Additionally, the Russian Revolution, also known as the Bolshevik Revolution, takes place, and Tsar Nicholas II and his family are killed. This revolution took place due to political unrest in opposition to the war happening among the general public. Also, additionally, around this time, America enters into the war. Advanced naval power and technology made the war brutal, more brutal than any war that had happened previously. At the end of World War I, the Paris Peace Conference took place in 1919, and that is where the Treaty of Versailles was created and signed. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to take all of the blame and to pay reparations for damages caused by the war, and they were additionally denied entrance into the League of Nations. The Paris Peace Conference is also where Woodrow Wilson brought up his 14 points. Woodrow Wilson became president at the end of World War I. He introduced the 14 points at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The 14 points called for open diplomacy, equal and fair trade, decreasing armaments, and adjusting colonial claims. All of these points he created in order to try and make the world a better place and less hostile in order to avoid further war. However, when the Treaty of Versailles was created and presented to the Senate, they refused to sign the treaty because of their isolationist views. The origins of the First Red Scare. The American people were nationalists and scared of communism because of the war. Additionally, the Bolshevik Revolution led to a fear of government overthrow in America. And when bombings began by radicalists and there was a rise in labor unions, radical ideals began to be feared by common Americans. Additionally, Palmer raids began in order to fight communism and to prevent the spread of communism to America. And the Palmer raids were essentially the arrest and deportation of illegal aliens, but they actually had a counter effect, which happened to be people opposed the Palmer raids and saw them as inhumane, and so that is what led to the die-down of the First Red Scare. The aftermath of World War I. Ellis Island opened in 1892 as an immigration station, and mostly immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe came through there, as those were countries really struggling after the war. Additionally, anti-immigrant sentiment increased during World War I, so immigration did decline, but Ellis Island did see a lot of action throughout the end of World War I. The 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, and this was made possible by women's suffrage groups. Additionally, the political climate towards women's suffrage turned the tides when President Woodrow Wilson switched his opinion to support the women's suffrage movement. 1921 Tulsa riots. Tulsa was a prosperous black community that was also known as Black Wall Street, but the white neighboring communities resented the black prosperity of the town, and so this brought about race riots. The entire neighborhood was destroyed in less than 24 hours, and it is seen as an egregious act of violence against black prosperity, and its effects still linger to this
Here
day.
is our works cited.